We're very privileged to have as our lecturers today Patricia Gándara, Research Professor of Education in the Graduate School of Education and Information Sciences at the University of California, Los Angeles, and Gary Orfield, Distinguished Research Professor of Education, Law, Political Science, and Urban Planning, also at UCLA. Professors Gándara and Orfield are co-directors of UCLA's Civil Rights Project. For those of you who are new to the Provost Forum, the goal of this lecture series is to advance informed understanding and dialogue on the many challenges currently facing public universities such as our own. Our guiding question is, what should and can the public university be in the 21st century? Our featured speakers will receive a proper introduction in just a couple of minutes. So before I thank the units and individuals who've made today's events possible, I want to make a brief observation about today's program. As you know, this afternoon, Professors Gándara and Orfield will, as it were, enter the lion's den and present a provocative discussion of access to higher learning for students of color, including affirmative action. Even in a group such as this one, which shares a common commitment to access and opportunity for students of all backgrounds, the general subject of access and the narrower one of affirmative action can be sources of significant and passionate disagreement. This brings me to my observation. In recent weeks, our national headlines have all too often referred to stories that are both tragic in themselves and reflective of larger issues concerning racial and cultural division and unequal justice. I'm speaking, for example, of the tragic deaths of Eric Garner, Michael Brown, and Tamir Rice at the hands of law enforcement, the subsequent angry and sometimes destructive and violent protests across the country, partly in response to the failure of grand juries to deliver criminal indictments. And just last week, two events with especially dire implications. One was the terrorist attack on the offices of Charlie Hebdo in Paris as retaliation for the publication of cartoons deemed offensive to Islam. The other was the less publicized bombing of the NAACP office in Colorado Springs, Colorado, an act of undetermined motivation that nevertheless has evoked fears of a return to forms of anti-Black terrorism we saw in the middle of the last century and before that. I refer to these recent headlines to underscore a simple fact. One of the reasons universities are so crucial to our society is that when they function in a way that honors their own high ideals and public trust, they successfully enforce a cultural covenant in which people are allowed to speak freely without fear of retribution, violent or otherwise. This is no small thing if you believe, as I do, that the way to truly serve progress and justice is through patient and often difficult communication. The hard work of coming to understand other positions and others' life experiences, and finally, an a priori respect for people who may think differently than we do, and recognition that there is more that connects all people than divides them. These are the true road to progress and justice, not the leveraging of violence, whether physical or some other variety. Today's program is more than a little relevant to the issues of culture, race, and social justice raised by the tragic and disturbing events I've just mentioned. It's also an example of how universities, as part of their normal operation, provide a space in which people of conflicting positions, even passionately held ones, can effectively address their differences through rational and respectful dialogue. To this, let me add that this lecture series as a whole supports and leverages this inclusive culture I am describing, but it is everyone in this room and the entire UC Davis community who are its true and solid foundation. Before I leave the subject of our program, let me remind you that all of you are invited to continue the discussion during the reception in this location immediately following our audience question period. Now a quick look ahead. Today's Provost Forum will be followed by 3 more this academic year. I hope that you'll be able to join us for these as well. Details for all events are available on my website, and flyers will be circulated. Our next forum, scheduled for Friday, March 6th, will feature Bruce Alberts, Professor Emeritus of the Department of Biochemistry and Biophysics at UC San Francisco. Professor Alberts will discuss issues, or flaws as he calls them, in biomedical funding system that most research universities are currently using. That should be of great interest to many in our community, and I would think more than a little provocative, as so many of our talks are, which I appreciate. I wish personally to thank the Provost Forum's organizing committee for their ongoing efforts and expertise in planning and arranging our events, the several campus entities that have joined my office to co-sponsor this event, the UC Davis School of Education, the Chicano/A Studies Department, the Community and Regional Development Program, and the Center for Regional Change. Our moderator, Carlos Jackson, Associate Professor and Chair of our Department of Chicano Studies. And last but not least, great thanks to Professors Gándara and Orfield for speaking with us today. Now, Professor Jackson, will you introduce our speakers?
It's a privilege to be able to do so. Thank you for being here today. It's an incredible opportunity to engage what I think should be really the center of a question of the role of the University of California in the future, is the way in which, to some degree, how our future really depends on the degree to which we are representative of this state. The state of California, which is in drastic demographic transformation. I teach Chicano Studies 280 students in this past fall, a really wonderful class, and I started off the first day just talking about that one question of what is our state going to look like if we do not have a representative university system of our backgrounds, of not just in terms of numbers, in terms of race, but also in terms of broad understandings of the different ways of thinking and being that exist in our society. So I start off with a set of slides of demographics, and then one of the things that I talk to the students about is how the LA Times reported, I think last year, that one baby was born that then tipped the majority population in the state of California, that now put Chicanos and Latinos as the majority in the state for the first time since California statehood. Yet to look at our numbers here at the University of California at Davis or across the system, we are reaching wonderful numbers in proportion, in relationship to what they have been, but still nothing close to representative of this state. And really, if this is the population of the state of California in the future, to what degree are we educating this growing population, or are we continuing to, and what are we going to look like if we're not? And that's ultimately like the task that I put forth to my students in Chicano Studies 10, and ultimately it's part of my argument for why ethnic studies, Chicano Studies is so important, is because it's in disciplines like this where a different type of cultural competency, a different type of epistemology or understandings and knowing ways of being can be understood. So that way, when we have doctors and lawyers and teachers teaching to these communities, they're not being taught from a hegemonic perspective, but rather from a true understanding of community. And the only way that we can truly have a representative health, education, public policy, and law systems and structures is if indeed we are relating to communities from their position and from where their starting point. And I think ultimately that's one of the chief reasons why a lot of first-generation Chicano students have difficulty when they come to UC Davis and to other UC campuses, is their expectations of the institution versus the reality of the institution, right? What their education means to their families as a first-generation college student, yet who that young person really is and who they need to become here. And the way these things are often in conflict with economic, very severe and often prevalent economic pressures. Dealing with all that, then making one feel as if they are weak, when in fact it's not that they're weak, it's that the structure and the way in which they relate to it and have related to it is somewhat flawed. So this question of the question that's here today that Patricia and Gary are going to share with us really has to be in the front of everything that we're doing on this campus. It just has to, if we're going to be relevant 20 or 30 or 40 years down the line. And I look forward to the discussion, and I'm very, very grateful to the provost and to the organizing committee for having these two incredible national and international scholars to talk to us about it. So very briefly, Patricia Gándara, long known to the campus community here at UC Davis. I think I can say, worked very hard to diversify and transform the department and then School of Education here. Her efforts have long been known by her colleagues in Chicano studies and across the campus for being truly instrumental in working to put forward an educational space that is more representative of our state. Patricia was faculty in the School of Education here from 1990 into 2006. In 2006, Patricia moved to UCLA to join Professor Orfield's efforts in establishing the Civil Rights Project in California, and we're very grateful for that, serving as co-director. Patricia is now Professor Emerita in Education in the Graduate School of Education and Information Sciences at UCLA. Being at UCLA for Patricia is a sort of return, as this is where she received her PhD in educational psychology. She has been a bilingual school psychologist, a social scientist with the RAND Corporation, and a director of education research in the California State Legislature. Since 1990, she has been a professor of education in the University of California system. She also serves as a commissioner for post-secondary education for the state of California, associate director of the Linguistic Minority Research Institute, and co-director of PACE, Policy Analysis for California Education. Gary Orfield has also recently attained emeriti status. We found that out today? Research professor, but having previously served as distinguished professor of education law, political science, and urban planning at UCLA. Before moving the Civil Rights Project to UCLA to be co-directed with Patricia, Gary served as professor in the Harvard Graduate School of Education. A political science by training from the University of Chicago, Gary's work has for over 3 decades engaged policy with regards to representation from a social justice perspective. At Harvard, in the wake of anti-affirmative action legislation in Texas and California, Gary developed the Civil Rights Project with the goal of establishing a body of research to demonstrate the implications of representation by underrepresented communities of rolling back civil rights policies such as affirmative action. Gary's work, like Patricia's, is monumental with broad impact nationally, and it's a privilege to have them here today and to welcome them to the podium.
Gary's going to kick it off, but can I just say thank you for that very lovely, lovely introduction.
We're going to go back and forth as we proceed through the issues that we're going to talk about today. The provost talked about the crisis the country's in. The country is polarized racially. It's obvious. We see very important things very differently across racial and ethnic lines, and we have very little leadership in helping us figure out how to move forward. That makes the college issue particularly important, because we're a society that's deeply stratified by race and by poverty. And we're also a society in which mobility has been decreasing. We have less mobility than most of Europe now. And we're also a society in which our success in our educating our students is falling behind our peer nations of the country. For a long time, we were first or second in the world in terms of college completion. We now are number 12, according to the OECD, and we're going down compared to other countries. That's not a level that will make for long-term success in a globalized economy. And one of the fundamental issues is that we are not educating the most rapidly growing part of our population, which happens to be Latino. If you look at the west of the United States now, if you look at the public school population of the West, about 40% is white. Almost as many are Latino. About 1 in 14 is black. About 1 in 8 is Asian. We're a country of 4 races. Or Latinos aren't a race, but racial and ethnic divisions in which different parts of the country are moving forward or backwards in very different ways. We're also a country where there's very little social policy. We don't have very much in the way of social support systems compared to other peer nations. We bet everything on education, and we claim that it's equal, it gives everybody a chance for mobility. and it happens to be a lie. We give the best elementary and secondary education to the most privileged populations and the worst to the most disadvantaged populations. All this works with great difficulty in a state that's going through a tremendous racial transformation, which is very stratified by race and poverty. We have the most segregated Latino populations in the United States now in terms of our public schooling, and in which the higher education system is unusually stratified by only allowing 1/8 of the students into its premier higher ed system. You put all those elements together and you get a totally explosive and dangerous mix unless you figure out how to make it work for the society that actually exists. That's what makes us have such a strong interest in affirmative action and other issues of educational access. So we're going to talk about how we began this work. That's going to be the first part. Then we're going to move on to kind of describing what our best current research is about what's going on.
I want to make one comment first, just before we do that, because you provoked my thinking too, Provost Hexler, when you talk about the university as being the place where these ideas need to be discussed and sometimes even battled out. You know, and I just think it's important because we'll be talking about the degree to which we are or are not preparing all of our young people for a future in this state, a viable future. But it's also, I mean, I think all of us who have dedicated our lives to the university, whatever university that is, right, I think share a particular passion for the idea of ideas and the free discussion of those ideas. But it's also, I think, so important to remember that that discussion only really happens well when you have good representation at the table for that discussion. So part of the issue, I think, is educating the folks. Part of the issue of diversity is having a good representation at the table when these ideas are brought up, because we've seen so often how if some folks are missing, it turns out to be a very different discussion. So go ahead.
So let me tell you an anecdote to follow that point, which is absolutely true. We did a book called Diversity Challenged that actually was cited by the United States Supreme Court in 2003 in upholding affirmative action. It was a series of original studies. The last of them was written by Professor Emeritus of Southern History from the University of Virginia. And he said, you know, and the University of Virginia, where I started my career, at the time I went there was 99% white in a state that's about 1/4 black. He said, once we got African American students in our Southern history seminars, there were questions that had never been raised that had to be raised. And there were discussions that had never happened that just tremendously enriched the educational process. And I think that that's key to understanding. This isn't just about social equity, although it is about social equity. It's also about academic strength and creativity.
Thank you.
So we started doing work on affirmative action at Harvard in 1996 because California outlawed affirmative action and because a federal court in Texas outlawed affirmative action the same year. And Chris Edley, who's a law professor at Harvard and was an advisor to President Clinton on affirmative action, and I decided to hold a conference and to see what the country knew about affirmative action and how it was working and how it could be defended. We brought together leading researchers, policy analysts, presidents of about 20 universities and so forth. We met secretly in the basement of one of the buildings at Harvard, and we tried to assess where we were in terms of what we understood. And what we discovered was that the basic research hadn't been done, that nobody had bothered to do it, that everyone in the academic world just assumed diversity was a good thing, but they didn't have the proof. And they didn't have anything much at all about the benefits to whites and Asian students. And so we decided to create a research project. That's what researchers do. But we decided to create an unusual one that would link research to law and to the groups that needed the research, to make sure that we did research that wasn't, as we thought, harmless, but to do research that would really be very good in academic sense, but directly address issues that were about the future of our society. That's what led to the creation of the Civil Rights Project, which is really a network of researchers all over the country. Since that time, we've commissioned over 500 studies. We have about 20 books out from this work. But some of them have been cited by the highest courts in the country. They've been used in many settings all over the country. And in some cases, they've actually changed things. In many cases, they've informed debates and brought them to another level. When we moved it to California, we expected to expand, and we did expand a lot in the work that we did on issues of Latinos. They were always in our research design, but it's different when you're here. And to the tremendous richness of multiracialism. It just doesn't exist in the same way in New England. And also to think about crossing the border, talk about Mexico as well as the US, and those things have happened. In terms of our work was designed to get the best scholars that we could find in the United States and ask them the hardest questions. And then we typically hold conferences where they'd be challenged by the most acerbic lawyers in the United States. How can you defend that? Do you have evidence for that? Have you considered the alternative thing? Have you done this or that? They cross-examined. And it was powerful because basically that conversation hadn't taken place before, and those lines were opened in important ways. In terms of what we learned that there was a lot of benefits to everybody from diversity, and we began to publish those data. And we were assuming that there would be a Supreme Court fight not too far down the road in 1996. But it didn't happen until 2002 in the Michigan case. And when the Michigan case was argued, almost every brief dealt with the research that we commissioned or the colleagues that we worked with. And when the decision came down, we knew it was going to be a 5-4 decision because basically on the court there were 4 who always voted against civil rights, and there were 4 who almost always voted for it, appointed by different political parties, as you might guess. We didn't know what the 5th vote would do. Everybody knew it was going to be Sandra Day O'Connor. The day of the decision, we read her opinion, and in the opinion, it cited a brief that we'd written, cited a book that we published, and it cited colleagues that we worked with from other universities for important points like the fact that diversity actually works, that it actually does make educational differences, that there is scientific evidence for that, that it is relevant to the future of democracy, it is relevant to the future of the economy and so forth. So it was amazing, but it was a 5-4 decision in a deeply polarized court in a deeply polarized country, and we knew that that was not going to be the end of it. And of course, it relates to many other issues. So that's how we got into this issue. And part of what we did was to hold a conference here in Sacramento that Patricia was a central actor in about the future of California higher education. And it produced an important set of journal issues and a book, which was important, which she will now demonstrate. Yes. It didn't have the same impact that we had on the Supreme Court, but we have been deeply involved in this issue since we came here and before. There have been 2 recent Supreme Court battles over affirmative action in the country. One is called Fisher versus the University of Texas. The University of Texas was the case in Bruder as well. University of Michigan was. But the University of Texas was challenged in 2 cases. In the Fisher case, basically the argument was since the University of Texas had the percent plan, that was enough. And we had done a lot of research on percent plans, so that work was relevant. We coordinated a brief that 440 researchers from all over the country signed, scholars who had done work in this field. That case ended with, we'll talk about the specifics of it a little later, but there's also a case that came from the University of Michigan called Schuette. Schuette is the Attorney General of Michigan, versus the coalition to defend affirmative action. Both of those cases were also decided 5-4. And neither one of them was the ringing affirmation of affirmative action, although we'll talk about the specifics of them a little later. Part of the work that was done in that period was a very important study by Professor Gándara and Bill Kidder over at UC Riverside, who is also a high-ranking administrator, but still a very active scholar, the best kind of administrator, who did a report called California, a Case Study, which talked about what's actually happened in California, and which we will talk about a lot today. So the University of California, before affirmative action, was virtually devoid of minority representation. In 1966, they did the first count that they ever made of the racial population of the University of California. Imagine, this was late in the Civil Rights Revolution. This was 14 years after Brown versus Board of Education. And this is a count actually of Berkeley. Berkeley's the only place that counted its population. You can see there were 1% black students, 0.36% Latinos, 0.28% Native Americans. About 98% were white.
We don't even have Asians. So.
They didn't count Asians either at that time. But you can see that the University of California, and this is characteristic of almost all universities, major research universities in the United States at the beginning of the 1960s. Most of them had changed somewhat by 1966.
Not
But
us.
if you read Bowen and Bach's famous book, The Shape of the River, you see that if you look at the Ivy League institutions, almost all of them had numbers like this as of 1960, although most of them changed by 1963 or 64 to some extent. But you can see before affirmative action, we had a higher education system that was totally non-representative of our population. And affirmative action was a step to try to explicitly change that by considering race in admissions and so forth. In terms of the 60s, there was a huge expansion in university spaces that went on. New campuses were created for the UC and all over the country, and thousands of community colleges were initiated. It was a period of a boom in higher education. This is also the period of the first federal aid to education for poor kids. That was the Pell Grant, came out of the 1965 Higher Education Act. It's also the period of the great Civil Rights Acts. As of the early 1960s, we still had 19 states that had legally separate public universities for blacks. 19 states. And those states, a large majority of black people lived in those states. So we're not very far away from a very dismal condition. So affirmative action came out of a desperate failure of elite higher education to represent the society in any important way.
Maybe it's a good point to say, too, at 1965,
Yeah.
we still were barring Asian immigration.
Well, not until the Immigration Act of 1965 did we end the effect of the Chinese Exclusion Act and the Gentleman Agreement to keep Japanese out and so forth. We didn't have any significant immigration from either Asia or Africa until, as part of the Civil Rights Revolution, the Immigration Act was passed in 1965, which has now transformed our country, especially California.
Shifting back to California.
Coming to California again, early in the 1960s, the California Supreme Court issued a really important case called Jackson versus Pasadena School District, City School District, in which the question was raised whether the California Constitution had anything to say about segregation. Now, California historically had legally required segregation of Asians and Indians. They hadn't required segregation of Latinos. There weren't very many here after the Mexican-American War. But they had a history of legal segregation, and then they had a practice of segregation almost everywhere for Mexican Americans, which wasn't really challenged until the 1940s. In 1963, the California Supreme Court said, it doesn't matter where the segregation comes from. Segregation's evil. It violates the Constitution of California. We have a legal responsibility to do something about it. That was the kind of high point of constitutional law, California. In
1981.
Now, after affirmative action happened, and we're going to, we could give you a whole semester on this.
Like we do sometimes.
Yeah. But after affirmative action happened in California, and California began to respond, some places, like UC Davis, took fairly dramatic steps, especially in its medical school, where they actually created a set-aside of seats in the medical school entering class for students from underrepresented minorities. Since the university had almost never trained any significant number of people of color at all to supply the medical needs of very large populations. That was challenged by Bakke, who was a white student who said that he was denied on the basis of his race or ethnicity, and challenged the set-aside of the UC. In this case, in 1978, affirmative action was upheld by the Supreme Court, but by a single vote. And it was upheld on a very narrow ground. The court said you couldn't consider the history of discrimination as a justification. You couldn't consider the needs of the society. You could only do this because diversity had an educational value. And that finding was based on a report of a faculty committee at Harvard University, where the justice who made the decision, Justice Powell, had gone to law school. Justice Powell was a Southern conservative who had blocked desegregation in Richmond. He had written an article saying Martin Luther King was a communist sympathizer. He was not a liberal, but he created the basis on which affirmative action has been upheld ever since, which is that diversity is a compelling interest, and universities can consider race as a way to achieve diversity. But that narrowed the discussion because basically we had a history of unequal education and a present-day condition of unequal education that we couldn't consider. We had to separate our consideration of public schools and colleges, even though they directly relate to each other, and we couldn't consider remedial justifications of affirmative action. This narrowed the debate about affirmative action ever since. But it did make it possible to keep affirmative action. But this was pretty much the high point of affirmative action in the late 70s. This was the only period in American history when Black and Latino students who were graduating from high school had about an equal chance of starting some college. Once the 80s came and we moved against financial aid, raised tuition, and did numerous other things, colleges became more unaffordable and more stratified year by year. Go ahead. I have one more. Okay, in the 1990s, we had the beginning of a generalized attack on civil rights, both here in California and in the nation. And by the late 1980s, anti-civil rights majority had general control of the United States Supreme Court. Justice Rehnquist was appointed Chief Justice. He had actually opposed the Brown versus Board of Education as a clerk in the Supreme Court. And he had worked against public accommodations laws in Phoenix, where he was a young lawyer. He had actually harassed black voters. He was a really strong conservative who never voted for a single school desegregation case, for example, while he was serving for many years. Anyway, the Supreme Court was changing. We would get our first decision reversing school desegregation in 1991, which called for the dissolution of school desegregation plans around the country, in a case from Oklahoma City. Here in California, basically there was a political polarization about race. And there were 3 changes in the California Constitution enacted. Already there was a proposition that had been enacted in the 1980s to limit the school desegregation powers as a result of the Los Angeles school desegregation case. So that radically limited the meaning of the California Constitution. In 1994, there was an adopted Proposition 187 to limit the public services for immigrants. 1996, the anti-affirmative action proposition, which was supported very actively by the presidential candidate of the Republican Party that year. It was very highly polarized. In 1998, the decision prohibiting most forms of early bilingual education. So we had, and it was an explicit policy to what you called wedge issue politics, to polarize the state. And it worked until the late 1990s, when all of a sudden a whole political party was wiped out of all the major offices in California, partially as a result of the reaction of a changing population.
Okay. So in just 1 second, I'm going to take it back to the University of California, its response to all of this, what have we attempted to do. But first, I saw Harold Levine walk in, and so I'm going to go back for 10 seconds to a point that we made earlier, but I think this is a really important point for Davis. So this was 2003. Harold had been here for a year, I think is the dean of this.
Everybody know who Harold is?
Yeah, our dean of the School of Education here, our dean. And with the Civil Rights Project, we decided it was time to take the temperature of the situation here in California. And what better place to do that than in Sacramento with the Legislative Analyst's Office, with actually the first talk ever given by the new president of the University of California at that time, by the heads of the education committees. So Dean Levine helped sponsor this whole event here, which did then result in a book and journal articles and all of that. But it was a pretty watershed moment here because we were taking stock here in Sacramento with all the folks that did education policy about where had this gotten us and what did we need to do. And so that's where the book and that come from. But I do want to give kudos to Dean Levine because he'd barely gotten here and we already had him, hanging out on a limb here on this. So what Gary said earlier, though, too, about the importance of Bakke taking other issues off the table continues to resound through the ages up to the moment, because by making the central issue one of diversity, I mean, that's nice, we think it's good, but by taking off the unequal education that occurs in the preparation for college, taking it out of the courts, that has stymied us so much in being able to make what I would call the real resounding arguments here. So this slide that I'm going to show you has gone back and forth between being a graph and being a table, being a graph and being a table, because I don't know the best way to show it, but it's a graph. I mean, it's a table now. And what you need to notice here, so as most of you know, but if there's anybody who doesn't, in California we have the Academic Performance Index, and that can be broken into deciles, and decile number 1 is those lowest performing schools that we have in the state, the ones that prepare almost nobody to get ready for college. And decile 10 is our very highest performing schools, and those top 2 deciles are where the bulk of the UC population comes from, quite frankly. That's where we get our students because they have been prepared for the university. So who's there in deciles 9 and 10? Half of all Asian students are in those 2. 40% of white students are in those 2. And consider that for African American and Latino students, we're looking at 9 and 12% of the entire population finds itself in those schools that really do prepare you for college. I've included English learner in there because actually on a lot of these stats, they actually are even somewhat worse off than everyone else. And then if you look at the other end of this, who's in the lowest performing schools, it's just the mirror opposite, right? Virtually a mirror. Overwhelmingly, these are African American and Latino students. We don't have Native American on here because the numbers are so tiny that it's hard to register on here. But this, in my mind, is the elephant in the living room. I mean, how do we even begin the discussion about fairness, about equity, about moving forward in this state if this is how our students are positioned from the very beginning? So I'm going to tell you now, I want to make sure that we have time for discussion, so I'm going to try and go through. Yeah, part of a discussion that we had. We did a report actually a couple years ago looking at community colleges that were especially successful with underrepresented students. As a part of that, we took the universe of data from the community colleges, and one of the things we found there was that you could absolutely predict the performance level of the community college by the student's high school. So it's just, you know, if you're in one of these decile 1 or 2 high schools, you're going to be in a decile 1 or 2 community college as well. So this is you know, a continuing pattern in the state. But so what I want to go over with you very quickly, but still provide time for us to have some discussion and questions and answers, is how has the University of California responded to that challenge of losing affirmative action in the system. And I want to start this by noting something that I think has been missed by a lot of folks along the way, but I think is powerful language. I think it's worth noting that the Organic Act, which was the document that actually established the University of California in 1868, includes the following founding language for the university. It shall be the duty of the regents, according to population, to so apportion the representation of students, when necessary, that all portions of the state shall enjoy equal privilege therein. Those are pretty powerful words, right? And I think they speak exactly to what we're talking about today. And yet, over 100 years, it seems to be pretty much forgotten. And it's also, I think, important to note that when Proposition 209 passed here in California in 1996, every UC chancellor went on record to oppose the passage of that bill, of that initiative, in part because the university was already grappling with a serious underrepresentation of, quote, minority students, and because the Office of the President had done projections on what the impact would be. But I do think it is always important to remind people that even when we had affirmative action, the ways that we implemented it, or did not, were leaving us in less than a stellar position with respect to representation. And in fact, in those very years, there was a tremendous amount of concern about where we were headed as a university because our representation of underrepresented students was so poor. And then we got hit with 209. So the university was, in fact, aware that this was going to be fairly disastrous for us. And an internal briefing paper that was assessing the state of admissions post-Prop 209, Saul Geiser, who at that time was in the Office of the President, and his colleagues wrote, quote, "Contrary to the conventional expectation that over time, UC's eligibility pool will increasingly resemble the population of the state, our projections suggest the opposite. Underrepresentation of groups with historically low UC eligibility, which is the way we used to do this, you know, and college-going rates is likely to worsen rather than improve over time." And that's what we're going to show you. This conclusion was based on the projected population demographics and the well-known inequities in college preparation, which we have just seen in the state schools. So, following on the passage of Prop 209, there were a series of strategies. Yeah, this is what there was a task force was appointed to deal with this, and that task force was to expand, their job was to oversee the expansion of student-centered programs such as MESA, EAOP, and Puente. They were to create partnerships, I always have to pause at this point, partnerships with 50 underperforming high schools in the state. That's a noble idea. However, it's less than 5% of the high schools in the state. So a noble but a very limited idea. They were to expand informational outreach, because one of the things that we had found in research that we were doing was that many parents, particularly of immigrant students, had no clue how you would ever prepare for or apply to the University of California, and they were getting no information about it. And then also to create a research and evaluation team to oversee this. And I served on that, which tells you where my role is in all of this. So the post-Proposition 209 strategies were to increase outreach and what became SAPEP programs, the student, I always forget, the student, academic preparation and educational partnership programs, to look at eligibility in local context, because Texas had been doing this. Texas had gone the route of the 10%. Why don't we try something like that? Maybe that'll work here, but gosh, we can't afford to take 10% of all of our schools, so we'll try 4%. Comprehensive holistic review, which all campuses now do. Changes in standardized test requirements, which is not quite certain what that has really done for us. And an increased focus on community college transfer. This basically, you guys, is what we have done to try to address the devastating drops in representation of underrepresented students. It's the best that folks could come up with. It's the best that people were doing across the country. So now I'm going to go really much faster. We initially got a big infusion of money from the legislature. We were spending quite a lot of money on doing these things up until about 2004-05, when the budget started to go south in the state, and that commitment began to die. So what have these efforts yielded? This is the best we knew how to do, and we did it the best way we knew how to do it. We have served about 56,000 students in 2012 with these programs, student academic preparation programs. However, very few of those students that we serve go on to the University of California. For example, there are 3 major programs and 15 smaller programs. EAOP serves 194 schools, half middle and half high schools. But the average GPA of the students served in that program is a 3.2. We take the students who are already on track to attend college, and we provide them with academic advising, academic enrichment, college entrance exam preparation, and college knowledge. This is not a bad thing. This is a good thing that we're doing this. And we know from other research that a lot of these students with 3.2s are going to fall right through the cracks. So this is not an argument against doing this. I just need to tell you what we get in the end. Less than 17% of the students who are supposedly served actually enroll in the University of California. So the University of California does a great job for the state. And I think we need to keep reminding them of that. We do a great job for the state, but this is not necessarily diversifying our campuses that well. MESA, which is the second program, is on 5 UC campuses with about 100 middle and high schools to provide services for students who have, quote, math science aptitude. So they're scoring high in these areas. They tend to be high-performing students, and a third of them are not minority, are not underrepresented students. There's more of a mix of schools, and not all the schools that are served are low-performing or low-income schools. And of that, we get a quarter of the MESA students graduating and going on to UC. But this is a small number. And finally, we have Puente, which serves 36 high schools with high Latino populations, takes a mix of students from high achievers to low achievers. This is the only program that actually does try to pull in the lower achieving students and focuses on teacher training, counseling, and mentoring. 10.4% of its 942 graduates in 2012 went to UC. So 10% of 942 graduates. These are all minuscule numbers when we consider that we take in on an annual basis in the freshman class about 40,000 students across the state. So overall, a very small percentage of students in these programs actually enroll in UC, And because UC cannot target students by race, most programs are located in low-income schools, but many of the students served are not underrepresented students. For example, of the 2,400 students served at EAOP, the Early Academic Opportunity Program at Berkeley, in 2012, only half were underrepresented students. So 1,200, and then you have a percentage of those who go on. We also do not know to what extent the students served are the same students that would have otherwise gone to the University of California. We are not able to say that. But you can get a sense from most of the programs that they're fairly selective and working with students who have the best chance, that there's certainly a lot of overlap there. So the eligibility in local context, when we did 4%, there was no discernible impact. Now we have moved it up to 9%, and we understand that the 9%, so the top 9% of all schools in the state, yields actually a less diverse pool than the regular freshman pool. So that hasn't pumped us up. Comprehensive review, there have been 2 large studies done, one at Berkeley and one at UCLA, because those were the lead campuses to do holistic review. And I cite from the 2012 UCLA study, which says that there is, quote, little evidence that much weight is placed on hardships. In other words, basically when we do holistic review, it's scores, test scores and GPA that wins the day. People aren't really paying much attention to that. And only 6% of applicants actually go to a supplemental review at UCLA. A very small percent are actually really looked at carefully for these kinds of challenges. And then finally, people have long thought, well, the way we have to diversify the University of California is by pulling in more community college students, because that's where the diversity is in our state. So we go there to get our students, and we have to really refocus ourselves on transfer. But what you need to know about that is that the entering freshmen coming straight from the high schools is actually more diverse, and has been historically, by the way, is actually more diverse than the transfer students we get from the community colleges. What I'm telling you is all of our best efforts have not been an effective replacement of a targeted view of those underrepresented students. So I'm just showing you quickly a couple of graphics here. The Latino Enrollment Gap between 1995 and 2013. Some folks like to point to the fact that, oh, we have a lot more Latinos in the University of California now. But if you look at the gap in 1992, before we passed Proposition 209, and the gap today between the actual high school graduates and the students that we take in, that gap has gotten bigger, as the Geiser report had predicted. The Black enrollment gap is a similar thing. Let me see. Yeah. Shows well, no, I wanted to, oh, okay. Oh, that's what, okay, I'm sorry, I'm losing the, so this is the underrepresented minority gap, okay. So looking just at underrepresented groups, that gap for all groups has gone wider. And then we look at the Latino enrollment gap, and you can see it parsed out there by Davis, Berkeley, and UCLA. I won't spend a lot more time on that, but we'll provide these tables for you. This is part of a report that we're about to publish. And the same thing for the African American gap. There's interesting stuff there. You see the massive drop. And then I think what's interesting is you see a little uptick, and these are such minuscule numbers, it's almost embarrassing to talk about it. You see a little uptick for African Americans at UCLA. That was because the situation became so horrendous at UCLA. Less than 3% of the freshman class, I think it was 2.8, was African American, that the African American community organized itself, went out and got money to fund these students full ride because it was the only way that we were able to get these students to decide to come to a campus where they were going to be so incredibly alone. Okay, so that's it for me. Gary's going to come back and talk a little bit about the evolving legal context.
Yeah. And I'm watching at time, so
Yeah.
I realize we're not going to have much time for conversation, so I'm going to try to go over this quickly.
Yeah.
And this would be a whole law school class. In the Supreme Court, by 5-4, sustained affirmative action in the University of Michigan case in 2003. 4 years later, in the case about the future of school integration, it greatly limited voluntary desegregation activity in the country in a case called Parents Involved. That was a signal that they might be ready to get rid of affirmative action altogether. So the opponents of affirmative action went back to court in a case from Texas, because Texas has what's considered the most extensive alternative with its percent plan. In that case, the Supreme Court, called Fisher, the Supreme Court really didn't reach a clear decision. It left standing precedent. It said affirmative action was a compelling interest, but it raised the standards for justifying it by any university. And it didn't tell us what those standards were. It said any federal judge had a lot of authority to decide whether or not the university had enough justification. And right now, there's a further litigation pending in Texas, and the Texas case has been appealed to the Supreme Court as well. They're just big lawsuits filed against Harvard and the University of North Carolina challenging their affirmative action. So this isn't over by any means. In a case that was last year decided, Schuette from the University of Michigan, a group of civil rights activists in Michigan from an organization called BAM that some of you are probably familiar with, challenged the Michigan referendum that outlawed affirmative action, which was modeled on the California Proposition 209. And the basic argument to the Supreme Court was that this amendment to the state constitution of Michigan, in effect, wrote into the Constitution a prohibition against ever doing anything positive, racially explicitly positive in the state, even if the majority of voters in the state wanted it to happen, or the majority of legislators. You'd have to change the Constitution before you could do it. And there were two earlier Supreme Court decisions, including one here in California, about a referendum that had outlawed fair housing laws in 1964, and a referendum in the state of Washington that had outlawed school desegregation plans. In both of those previous ones, the Supreme Court had said, you can't change the state constitution to eliminate rights permanently and make it unfair so that a majority can't restore civil rights. In the case of Schuette, the Supreme Court by 6-2 said it was fine to do that. If Schuette had gone the other way, the California Proposition 209 would have gone down. This means the only way you can change these provisions in states that have constitutional amendments is to change the Constitution again, which is an enormous burden on a minority community. Okay. Yes. We now have a situation that may produce some of the political change that might be necessary to change the Constitution in California and in some other places. What we had was basically a takeover by civil rights supporters of the state government in 1998. There are no offices, statewide offices held by conservative civil rights opponents now. The California, what you were going to talk about?
Okay. We're at the very end now anyway.
Yeah.
So what we wanted to leave some time to discuss is where we are right now in the state, yes, and what kinds of things are going on. And I'm sure many of you are aware that there was an aborted attempt to put a bill up.
A constitutional amendment.
A constitutional, well, yeah, it would have allowed for a constitutional amendment because it would have put on the ballot in 2016 the opportunity for the people of California to rethink Prop 209. And I don't say repeal, I say rethink it, because we don't know exactly what that would look like or what it will look like. But it would certainly be dedicated to the notion that we need some strategies beyond what we have done our very, very best at to try to provide more real opportunity for underrepresented folks. One of the arguments that we think we have on the side of something like affirmative action is that we have studies now that are showing the California economy at really dire risk. By the Public Policy Institute of California tells us that by 2025 we are 1 million bachelor's degrees short of meeting our basic labor force needs. We are not preparing the individuals we need to just maintain the economy where it is. What are we going to do?
We did a report on all of Southern California, and as of 2011, public schools in Southern California are 3/4 non-white, mostly Latino. And they're declining numbers of high school graduates, statewide actually. So you think about that and you think that what the labor market's demanding is educated people. We don't have enough of the traditional sorts who usually get educated in this state to educate. So we have to figure out how to educate the ones who we actually have, or we're going to decline. Texas is already in a declining average education level as a result of its failure to address this issue, and we will face that.
So there's new efforts.
Yes, there's new efforts, and there will be new proposals to try to change the restriction on affirmative action, and we will be hearing a lot of discussion of that in the months that come. It will be very important to address the important issues. What shot down the proposal that actually was voted for by 2/3 majority of the state Senate was a campaign to arouse tremendous fear in the Asian community of California, and to create a deep racial division in the state, because all the whites in the state Senate who are Democrats voted for the change, and so did all the African Americans and the Latinos. 3 Asians changed their vote, and that produced an inability of the legislature to act when it had the supermajority, which no longer exists. So now we have to have discussions among ourselves in this state about whether this is a zero-sum game or it's a positive-sum game. Whether if somebody doesn't get into a particular university, somebody else, that's the only way for somebody else to do it, or whether we can figure out how to expand the pie, change the definitions, and make everybody realize that if we don't have a healthy economy, nobody's going to gain. So figuring out how to do that is a challenge to this generation of Californians. So if we don't figure out how to do it, it's going to be deep problems. There's got to be a lot of deep discussions going on because we're so separated from each other. Back in 1970, the average Latino student in the state of California was in a 54% white public school. They're now in an 83% non-white, 75% poor public school. And all the groups are so isolated from each other residentially and educationally that they don't really understand each other's circumstances very well. And that's a particularly important role for people who are researchers, university people, educators, trainers of educators, to figure out how to make these discussions happen and figure out how to help people understand common interests that go across the lines of social division.
And so we leave it that there will be more of a grassroots effort. This is probably not going to come out of the legislature, but will come out of folks organizing across the state. And going back to Provost Hexler's comments at the very beginning, I think there is no better place in the state of California for these conversations to begin and to be extended, and for people to be thinking about very clearly about the future of California than on our university campuses. And we would love to come back, in 6 months and find that there are serious conversations going on here at UC Davis about how we're going to attack this problem.
The stakes are very high. Our last 18 years of research has not been able to identify anything that works as well as affirmative action.
Yeah, which is what I tried to
Affirmative
demonstrate.
action doesn't work very well, but it works much better than trying to do it by indirection without mentioning what we're actually trying to do. That's the dilemma that we face. We do not have a good alternative. We've been searching the country for it, and we've been searching California. If we don't face this, we have a predictable future. Can we figure out a way to come to a better future? That's the challenge that we leave you with.
Securities?
Yeah.
Okay.
So Patricia and Gary will fill the questions up here. Casey has the mics.
Well, it's Casey actually fills the questions. Hello.
Yeah. So if we accept the premise, like what we said in the beginning, that the university is the most prominent forum in which these conversations about diversity and social justice can happen, should be happening, we need to evaluate the systems we have to direct and recruit students into this conversation, because what students take or don't take from this conversation will ultimately inform their opinion and their vote on the matter. So how are we going to strengthen general education requirements to engage every student on this campus on issues of diversity and social justice, as well as strengthen existing courses to do that very thing, especially for students in fields less conducive or available to classes that talk about social justice, say like engineering or something.
Well, as you know, there have been big fights at both Berkeley and UCLA in the last months about whether we should have diversity course requirements in our curriculum. We, of course, think that they're desperately needed in this state, because if you don't understand your society, you're not going to have a really effective democratic community. That doesn't mean that every diversity class is going to make people understand all these complex issues, but it would be a step in the right direction. And it's a sensible step. I think what students do themselves is very important. If you know about the history of the civil rights movement, it was students at little colleges in the South that went in and decided they would not accept segregated lunches anymore. It was students who started many big changes in this country, and they should not feel powerless. Students are potentially very powerful in raising issues, deep, serious issues about the nature of their institutions, the nature of their society. And, I asked a student, one-time student of mine, Taylor Branch, who wrote the classic biographies of Martin Luther King, I said to him, if you read those books, the beginning of the civil rights movement, it started in little cities where it was a tremendous risk to take any step at all. I said, what starts a movement, Taylor? And he said to me, it's one person who stands up and says, I will not accept this. And other people stand up and say, neither will I.
Yeah, I'd also like to remind people that during the civil rights movement and after, we had this phenomenon called teach-ins. And we did this on all of our campuses. We did them on campuses across the country. And faculty and students came together to raise these issues and do it in a very independent way. So you didn't have to be enrolled in a class and hope that your professor was going to be able to handle this well. This was going on all over the campus, in tents and in all kinds of places.
One of the important things is that this be done in a civil way, respecting each other's views, letting everybody express their opinions, and not trying to suppress or shout down people you disagree with, any of those things. This was part of the genius of the civil rights movement. People dressed up, they sang hymns, they behaved right, they were nonviolent. They challenged people morally and in terms of facts. They didn't try to block them or force them, but they asked them to think about what their values actually meant and how they could be applied to the society. And they made people think about things that were uncomfortable to think about, but they ultimately changed the country.
Hi, you touched on something a few minutes ago, Gary, that I think bears some more thinking about. How many seats would we need to have in the University of California and in the California State University to do what the master plan for higher education in the state of California says we're supposed to do? I think part of this has to do with the perceived scarcity of an education and the fear. But making education plentiful was what brought California to the party in the first place. So I really want to know, how much are we short?
We are short a lot. We haven't been building campus capacity really for decades. And the population's been exploding. And that is an issue that we should all be talking about. The state government's support of higher education in California and the country as a whole has radically shrunk as the share that goes into prisons and healthcare and other things has risen. It's really unacceptable in terms of the future of the state, and we need to expand spaces. It would be much better to be arguing about how much to expand than how to divide an increasing shortage of space. If we don't expand, then each year the competition gets stronger because there's more competitors. We have 112,000 applications at UCLA this year. You know, if we had another 10,000 seats, it would be a much nicer recruitment and selection process than the one that we are going through right now. Similarly, if we're going to really talk about the master plan is a really nice plan to get the University of California huge resources compared to the other systems. We have to think about the CSUs, which is very, very important for minority opportunity in the state. And we have to think about the community colleges, where the vast majority of low-income minority families have to go. They're not allowed to go anyplace else, and there's not many private opportunities in California. We have to think about the fact that we've funded them miserably since Proposition 13 cut our tax base. We have to think about this whole system if we're going to think about it, because it goes much beyond just the University of California.
Yeah, I think the provost wants to respond to this, doesn't he?
One of the concerns I have as a faculty member here who sees a lot of my students struggle once they are here. We have a very low retention of Latina students, of Chicana students, of minority students, poor students. Given the inequity in college preparation that your table so greatly showed, how can faculty, counselors, all the people who are doing great work in retention, in the services we're trying to provide our students, how can the students themselves voice to the administration, to the state legislature, the great need of resources, of more resources for our minority students, low-income students, once they are here at the university? Because they're being accepted, but we don't have the resources to serve them adequately.
We know right now the president of the university is in a pitched battle with the governor on this issue around the budget. So folks that are more powerful than us are fighting this out. But I would comment that, you know, when the University of Texas did the 10% plan, they also included in that the Lone Star program? What is it?
It's called
the Longhorn Scholarship. And that included all kinds, a whole wraparound set of support services for the students who were coming in from the schools that had not traditionally sent a lot of students to the University of Texas. And in fact, what they found out afterwards is that those students were excelling above and beyond the regular admits. So there is evidence that if you provide that kind of support system that's wraparound, that's integrated, that follows them, you really can get some pretty good outcomes from students who are coming from schools that are not preparing them as well, but who have all the burning desire to excel themselves.
You know, I'm a political scientist, so I think about these kinds of issues a lot. And You know, I see that students, when something goes wrong, when there's a shortage or something, students are mad about something, they go and march over to the chancellor's office, which has kind of zero impact since the chancellor doesn't have much to do with it. They really need to figure out who's blocking these things and march there. You know, march out to these suburban school, communities where there are people who are willing to take anything out of the education system to protect the oil companies and so forth. You know, you really have to think about who's doing what, and don't just march against the nearest person that you that you could challenge. Think about who really is blocking opportunity in a serious way, and act there. It will make a difference. Most of these legislators don't hear from very many people. And they hear from lobbyists.
Well, they hear from lobbyists.
They want to hear they respond to stories. They're not researchers, but they do respond to human stories, and the story should be brought to them in their home districts. You know, that's a kind of organizing challenge that people need to think about. It seems to me, as if you're really going to have a movement about these issues. Don't keep it on the campus. It won't do any real good here. It'll make you feel good that like you've done something, but it won't really speak to anybody who has any power to do anything about it. And there are a lot of people who do have power to do something about it.
Thank you so much. And I'll also say that I hope in 6 months we have a lot of conversations going on. And I could comment just point out tomorrow, the chancellor and students are going to be going up to Sacramento and talking to legislators. Lots of things we need to change and resources we need to get. Question and help educate me about the legal issues. Were we to undo 209, undo the ban on affirmative action, how then would where the Supreme Court is on federal law, would that not still constrain us, or does that only constrain?
The Supreme Court has not forbidden affirmative action up until now. What it's done is it says you have to have a good justification for it, and you have to show that there isn't an alternative. And California is in a perfect position to show that there isn't an alternative because it's tried them all, seriously tried them all, and they have failed. So I think California would be in a strong position right now. Now, the whole future of the United States Constitution right now rests in the hands of an elderly judge from Sacramento named Justice Anthony Kennedy. He is the swing vote on these issues, and he will decide what the Constitution means if we have further cases of this sort. But he and this present majority is not going to be there forever. Whoever wins the next presidential election may very well be in a position to change the United States Supreme Court. The U.S. Supreme Court's been in the hands of conservative majorities appointed by Republican presidents who were elected with virtually no minority votes now for 42 years in a row. That could change with one single Supreme Court appointment. So this is part of the really high stakes of the next presidential election. But we could have a constitution that not only would support affirmative action, but would much more broadly define it and justify it than what we have now. So it's not permanent. Our political system is not permanent.
Yeah, and I do think about Provost Hexler. I do think about the fact that that affirmative action, as we were implementing it years ago, was not doing the job. I think we need to really give some serious thought to what it would look like, what our efforts would look like on a new round. Maybe not exactly the same thing, but certainly we need to be able to target resources to the folks who most need those resources, which is something we cannot do now, which is one of the things that has stymied us in really making greater progress. So I think we need to have the conversation about what needs to happen in the state going forward, but it needs to be a more creative conversation than we had in the past as well. What might a new generation of policies look like?
We also need to have a conversation about whether or not we need to keep all of our most disadvantaged students in our most disadvantaged high schools.
Right.
You know, can't we figure out a way to allow students to transfer? Can't we use the charter school system instead of increasing segregation to increase choices in a meaningful way? Can't we think about getting ourselves out of this box of isolating the most disadvantaged students in the most disadvantaged schools. That's within our power to change as well.
Yeah, which would be powerful. We probably have time. Okay, just for you.
Yeah. Does it work? Yeah. I have a slightly different take on the story. So first of all, I fully endorse all the ethical and moral appointments. As you hear from my accent, I'm not from this country, and I find it very difficult to see the way in which this inequality is persistent and which I as a faculty have to endure and to deal with. But I always think about it, Americans are not more stupid than anybody else in the world. So therefore I keep asking myself, is this system not working well? Does the United States not have a system that it exactly would like to have? You're still the biggest kid on the block. You still can afford much cheaper bachelor degrees that you import from the outside by changing a little bit and fiddling with the immigration laws. There is no, the system is not dysfunctional. Dysfunctional, it is one that you and I and both of us don't like. And we would like to do something against this, which are very good arguments, but it is not harming anyone. It is not producing less income, less profit, less waste in order to do things. So therefore, I'm thinking just by having the discussion might not be enough to think about a change of the entire education system.
I think that there are many people who are not affected personally and immediately in a negative way by the existing situation. But we are all affected as communities because we are not developing our talent, we're not developing our economic potential, we are increasing our stratification, we are supporting more than any other country in the world a gigantic prison complex to deal with the total failure to deal with young people of color in the society. So it is a costly thing. It's not a cost that's obvious to people who live in affluent suburbs. But it is a cost that's pretty obvious to people who think systematically about states and about large corporations, about the economic future. They know it. But we have to figure out a way to bring that into our politics. And the first step of that is to address the politics of fear that we saw come along in California in the 1990s, in this current epoch, in the fear that was spread in parts of the Asian population after this thing happened here in the state Senate. We have to address that fear, and then we have to talk, what's the evidence that there is harm done that we're losing? There's lots of evidence. It's much better to be number 1 in college completion than number 12, going down to number 15. That makes a difference.
But also let me just say that, the whole notion of the American dream that we all bought into, it was real. There was an American dream at one time. We were the country with the greatest economic mobility, and now we are not that. So there are lots of folks who are feeling this pain very directly because they're not moving out of the very, very low rungs where they are. So, yeah.
I'm thinking about, I'm interested in the way in which the degree to which we are preparing high school students effectively for access to and success in the UC system. And I'm just wondering, with the table, do we know if there's much research on high school contexts where the demographics have remained stable, but the movement has been up toward those upper 2 deciles? And might it be that kind of research might help us to sort of make some movement so that we're doing some wiggling and not just having stasis?
There are, if you were to do a scattergram, I don't know how many of you are social scientists, but if you were to show every single high school in the state and showing poverty on one line and race on another line, or showing academic achievement and either poverty or race on the other axis, you'd see that you'd see a very clear relationship, very powerful. You'd see a few outliers. You'd see a few outlier cases, and there are always a few. There's more on the elementary level than a high school level. Very few high school outliers that you can't predict on the basis of their poverty level and their race. You can predict, like in many studies we've done, 0.8 or 0.9 relationship with test scores, for example. So these are, and for many years people have been saying, well, there are these two schools that are different. And therefore they should all be different. But nobody's figured out how to generalize those conditions. So that tells us the basic social and economic structure of schools is very powerful. And it's very hard to change. But we should try to change it, but we should also try to get people out of that basic social and economic isolation. Both of these things are worthwhile goals, but we don't have any generalized, especially for high schools, any generalized model of reform that really moves schools by several deciles.
Yeah, it's a little bit. Okay.
So I've been asked by,
I just want to ask more of a reflection.
Can we give you a microphone?
This one's dead.
Yeah, well then,
The last word to the dean.
Oh, we can answer.
No, I see this is a reflection.
It's more of a reflection, but it's also a question. We've talked about the University of California's role in improving diversity, and clearly for good moral reasons and ethical reasons and political reasons, the diversity of our entering class is really important to the university. It's important to the state. No disagreement. But over the last 15 years, and Patricia, I'm looking at you too, I think that there's been a struggle within the University of California not about the diversity of an entering freshman or its output on the graduation side, but on whether the university really should be involved in K-12 education. So sure, we produce teachers, but all of those years when you saw all that money that came into the UC that you showed on your graph, it was over $100 million to do academic programs and educational partnerships. There were a lot of people in the university who felt that that was not our job. We shouldn't be doing it. Leave K-12 to K-12. We're higher ed, and we are, whether above it or not, it's not our responsibility. I think that still exists within the university. I think if you ask a lot of the leadership, and they will say, well, it's a good idea, but we really can't fund it. Let's let others. It's really K-12's job. It's the California Department of Education. It's the governor. He needs to put more money into that. I think there's a basic question that's still out there about the way in which the University of California should be involved in public education today, and especially around increasing the opportunities for kids from diverse backgrounds to learn, to be college ready, and to succeed at UC.
I'm not sure what, yeah.
What is it? Universities haven't had a really good track record of changing elementary and secondary schools. That's absolutely true. It seems to me at a beginning point, they absolutely have to display what's happening and report it and make it obvious what's going on. We have recently adopted in the state of California this local control funding formula, for example. Many of us who have studied the consequences of decentralization and putting out funds without any controls on them know that fails. We need to talk about those kinds of things. If you put out funds to school districts that are desperate for money, that have fired a lot of faculty and staff, and that have a union that wants a raise and so forth, and you don't put controls on the money, guess where the money will end up? It's very predictable. It won't end up with the English language learners and so on and so forth. Now, there wasn't much of a discussion of any sort from the academic world about that. That's exactly what they did at the beginning of Title I in the federal level. And it was a catastrophe. And there was no evidence that it did any good. Now we're doing that in our state, which has very serious elementary and secondary education. Shouldn't we be, those of us who are researchers, be speaking out about that, talking about it, watching what actually happens to the money and so forth? This is the big education reform of this generation in elementary and secondary in California. Now we're going to go into the Common Core, and we're going to be testing students who are not English speakers in English and punishing them again and punishing their teachers. Those are historic blunders, I think, and that the academic world needs to have a voice about. I mean, obviously it won't be a unified voice, but we need to look very critically at those kinds of things. Whether we can actually, since the UC trains only a small fraction of teachers and so forth, whether we can actually reach that level is another legitimate question. But we could certainly look at the level of superintendents and the higher levels in the education system and contribute pretty powerfully to it. Look at this little money from the Broad Foundation. It's training all of our superintendents around the country in a bad way, I think. But you know, we should think about what strategic ways we can make a difference and try to figure out how to do it. And of course, we'd never do it with a unified voice, given the fact we're all highly opinionated individual researchers. But we could certainly move the discussion to a more intelligent level than what it's taking place at now.
Yeah, I think I'll leave it at that.
So on behalf of the provost and Casey, who helps organize this, and there's a reception happening outside here, right outside the doors here. You're all welcome and invited to join Gary and Patricia in conversation informally outside. We hope you'll stick around and do that. I think just like as a last word, you know, as somebody like myself listening, there's a lot to be upset about. I think the current state of affairs, despite Frank's very provocative question earlier, and that's what a friend on a committee some time ago describing what the demographics at the University of California, Riverside called, we have an increasingly, in a situation that looks increasingly like academic apartheid. And I hope that here on this campus we can start to think about these things very critically, as we already do, and even more so. And thank you so incredibly much to Gary and Patricia for this very, very thoughtful discussion today. So thank you very much.